When incest generates fatal syndromes, the consequences transcend generations and devastate whole families. Nowhere was this more evident than in the isolated mountains of eastern Kentucky, where for decades the history of the Harlan family remained buried until its eventual exposure in 1967. With their dense forests and deep valleys, the Appalachian hills provided a perfect refuge for communities wishing to remain separate from the rest of society. Among these steep slopes, approximately 50 kilometers from the nearest city, lived the Harlan family, a lineage dating back to the first European settlers in the region during the 18th century. The first to document the case was Dr. Robert Caldwell, a rural doctor who attended to Kentucky's most remote communities. In his own words, recorded in his medical diary, he wrote, "Never in my 35 years of medicine have I witnessed such a concentration of congenital anomalies in a single family." The Harlans seemed to carry the weight of generations of consanguineous unions. Accessible only by a narrow dirt road that served the mountain was the Harlan property. Visitors were rare, and the family avoided contact with outsiders. When Dr. Caldwell first arrived at the property in response to an urgent call about a child with breathing difficulties, he was not prepared for what he would find. The main house was a worn, two-story wood structure surrounded by smaller huts spread across the property. In total, 32 people lived in that family complex. The patriarch, Jacob Harlan, was 68 years old in 1967 and wore a permanently severe expression. His wife Margaret was also his first cousin. But it was the third generation that revealed the true impact of consanguinity. Of the 9 sons of Jacob and Margaret, 7 had married among cousins. From these marriages were born 23 children, 17 of whom had serious developmental problems. Immediately, Dr. Caldwell noticed the distinctive characteristics: prominent jaws, very close-set eyes, clubbed fingers, and in various cases, severe intellectual deficiency. The most serious case was that of Timothy, a 12-year-old boy with Apert Syndrome, a rare condition characterized by craniofacial malformations and fused fingertips. Timothy was the son of 2 first cousins, Samuel and Ruth Harlan. The boy had difficulty breathing and suffered from constant pain due to pressure on his brain caused by the premature fusion of his skull bones. The geographical isolation of the family had been just the beginning. Over the passing generations, social isolation had become absolute. Jacob Harlan ruled his family with an iron hand, discouraging any contact with the outside world. Children did not attend school. Modern medicine was viewed with distrust, and marriages were arranged within the family circle. "We preserve our lineage," Jacob told Dr. Caldwell during his first visit. "Pure blood without contamination from the outside world." The doctor soon realized he was facing an unprecedented case of genetic isolation. Meticulously, he began documenting each family member, their kinship relationships, and medical conditions, creating what would become one of the most important case studies on the effects of consanguinity in the history of American medicine. However, what began as a medical case soon became a broader investigation. Alerted by Dr. Caldwell's preliminary report, local authorities began to question whether the children were being deprived of appropriate medical care and mandatory education. In June 1967, social workers visited the property accompanied by the local sheriff. What they found was described as medieval conditions. Children with more severe disabilities were kept in separate rooms, some tied to beds to prevent them from injuring themselves. Medical records were non-existent, and several children had never been officially registered. The case quickly gained the attention of the local press. The Louisville Courier-Journal published a cover story titled, "The Forgotten Family of the Mountains," reporting on the precarious conditions and genetic anomalies found among the Harlans. The report carefully avoided sensationalism but made clear the severity of the situation. Check to see if you're already subscribed to this channel so you don't miss any of the most impactful cases of genetic isolation ever documented in American history. Your subscription helps us continue to investigate these hidden stories that shaped entire communities and warn about the real dangers of consanguinity. The history of the Harlans did not start in 1967. To completely understand how a family came to such a degree of genetic isolation, we need to return to the late 18th century when the first Harlan reached the mountains of Kentucky. Ezekiel Harlan, a Scottish-Irish immigrant, established himself in the region around 1795, seeking to escape what he called the corruption of the eastern cities. He bought 200 acres of mountainous land, built a log cabin, and began raising his family away from the eyes of an expanding society. County historical records show that Ezekiel married his first cousin, Hannah, bringing with him a cultural pattern that was not uncommon at the time, especially among isolated communities. In the rural, isolated communities of the 18th and early 19th century, marriage between cousins was not only accepted but often encouraged as a way of keeping properties within families. Local historian Martin Thornberry, who extensively studied the isolated communities of the Appalachians, explains, these first colonizing families faced a reality very different from ours. Geographic isolation meant a limited group of potential marriage partners, and often economic considerations prevailed that are completely unknown to us now. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, further deepened the isolation of the Harlans. While Kentucky officially remained in the Union, the region was deeply divided. The Harlans, with their distrust of government authorities, withdrew even deeper into the mountains during this turbulent period. It is during this time that the diaries of Josiah Harlan, great-grandson of Ezekiel, offer a rare view of the family mindset. In an entry dated 1863, he wrote, "The world outside is shattering in war and madness. Here in the mountains, we preserve our way of life, our lineage, our traditions. We are the last guardians of the true American spirit." This rhetoric of purity and preservation became central to the Harlan identity. With each generation, the isolation was not only geographical but ideological. Children were taught early on that the outside world was corrupt and dangerous and that the family's survival depended on their union, literally. The 1880 census records 18 Harlans living on the original property, now expanded to 320 acres. Of these, 15 had the surname Harlan, suggesting that marriages within the family were already common. The census also notes that 3 children were listed as disabled, although without specifying the nature of the conditions. The turn of the century brought dramatic changes to rural America, but it little impacted the Harlans. While roads, telephones, and eventually electricity reached increasingly remote communities, the family deliberately remained on the sidelines of these advances. A 1948 report by the Kentucky Electric Company mentions that the Harlans refused the installation of electric lines on their property, preferring to continue with kerosene lamps. This technological isolation reinforced their social isolation. Without radios or newspapers, the family remained disconnected from world events. The Great Depression, the 2 World Wars, all these transformative historical events barely touched the closed universe of the Harlans. It was during the 1930s that Jacob Harlan, the patriarch Dr. Caldwell would find decades later, took the leadership of the family. Under his direction, the rules of marriage within the family became even more rigid. Local church documents show that he formally removed his family from the Baptist congregation in 1935 after a sermon where the local pastor spoke against marriages among close relatives. Jacob developed his own religious interpretation based on selective readings of the Bible and family traditions. This homemade religion emphasized the purity of the lineage and saw the Harlans as a chosen people designed to preserve values the rest of the world had abandoned. The family's isolation was so complete that during the polio vaccination campaigns of the 1950s, health officials did not even know of the existence of many of the Harlan children. Only years later, when records were examined after the 1967 intervention, was it found that at least 2 children in the family had died of polio, a disease easily preventable by the Salk vaccine available since 1955. As we advance to the 1960s, we can see how generations of isolation created the perfect conditions for a dangerous genetic concentration. The isolation was no longer just a cultural or geographical choice, it had been inscribed in the Harlan family's very DNA. When Dr. Robert Caldwell began to systematically document the medical conditions of the Harlan family members in 1967, he was unknowingly contributing to an emerging field of medicine, population genetics. His meticulous records, preserved today at the University of Kentucky, offer one of the most complete case studies on the biological effects of prolonged consanguinity. What we observed in the Harlan family is not simply an isolated case of marriage between cousins, but the cumulative result of generations of consanguinity, explained Dr. Elena Simmons, a geneticist at Johns Hopkins University who studied the case in the 1970s. It's like watching centuries of compressed genetic evolution in just a few generations. To understand what happened to the Harlans, we need to examine the foundations of genetics. Each person carries 2 copies of each gene, one inherited from the mother and one from the father. Many defective genes are recessive. Their effects only manifest when a person inherits 2 copies of the defective gene, one from each parent. In genetically diverse populations, the probability of 2 partners carrying the same defective recessive gene is relatively low. But when close relatives have children, this probability increases dramatically, as they share a significant percentage of their genetic material. First-degree cousins share approximately 12.5% of their genes. When they marry, the probability of their children inheriting 2 copies of the same defective recessive gene is much larger than in the general population. When this pattern repeats for generations, as in the case of the Harlans, the result is an increasing concentration of deleterious recessive genes. Among the Harlan children, Dr. Caldwell documented an impressive variety of rare genetic conditions. In addition to Timothy's Apert Syndrome, there were cases of polydactyly, extra fingers on hands or feet, in 6 children, syndactyly, fusion of fingers, in 4 children, retinitis pigmentosa, a degenerative retinal disease that leads to blindness, in 3 teenagers, cleft palate in 5 children, and varying degrees of intellectual disability in 14 children. Particularly remarkable was the case of the identical twins James and John Harlan, born in 1955. Both had a rare form of disproportionate dwarfism known as spondyloepiphyseal dysplasia. This condition, characterized by a short trunk and limbs and problems in the spine, is caused by mutations in the COL2A1 gene, which encodes type II collagen, an essential protein for bone and cartilaginous development. These twins represent one of the clearest cases of recessive genetic expression, observed Dr. Caldwell in his notes. Their condition was so rare that the likelihood of it occurring by chance in a non-consanguineous population would be practically nil. The impact of consanguinity was not limited to visible physical conditions. Subsequent studies of the Harlan medical records revealed an abnormally high incidence of congenital heart disease, kidney problems, and rare metabolic disorders. The average life expectancy in the family was significantly lower than the national average, only 47 years for men and 51 for women, at a time when American life expectancy was already exceeding 70 years. One of the most alarming findings came when Dr. Caldwell examined the unofficial birth records kept by the family itself. Of 49 documented pregnancies between 1945 and 1967, 14 resulted in miscarriages, 7 in stillbirths, and 3 in neonatal deaths in the early weeks of life. These numbers represent a gestational loss rate 3 times higher than the national average of the time. Can you imagine the silent suffering of these women? Losing child after child without access to adequate medical care, believing these tragedies were simply the will of God. Leave your comments saying, "What a preventable tragedy," to show how genetic education could have saved so many lives. The phenomenon observed in the Harlans has a scientific name, inbreeding depression. This term describes the reduction in the biological fitness of a population resulting from the accumulation of harmful genetic characteristics due to reproduction between genetically similar individuals. In her definitive report on the family, published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics in 1973, Dr. Simmons wrote, "The Harlans represent an involuntary natural experiment on the effects of prolonged consanguinity. The genetic consequences observed in this family offer undeniable evidence of the biological risks of close relatives marrying over multiple generations." She continued, "Particularly notable is the prevalence of rare conditions that usually occur at frequencies of less than 1 in 100,000 in the general population. In the Harlan family, we find multiple cases of these conditions in a group of only 32 individuals. For the Harlans, these were not abstract statistics but realities lived daily." Elizabeth Harlan, one of the few adults in the family who cooperated extensively with the researchers, described the experience of growing up knowing something was wrong with her family without understanding what it was. "We always knew we were different," she told Dr. Caldwell. "The way the people in the town looked at us when we rarely went there, the laughs of the other children. Jacob said it was because we were special, chosen. I only realized it was because we were sick." The discovery of the Harlan family in 1967 triggered a series of government interventions that would forever transform the life of that isolated community. The case quickly escalated from a medical concern to a matter of child welfare, generating a debate on the boundaries between religious freedom, parental rights, and the protection of children. In July 1967, a month after the social worker's first visit, the Kentucky Department of Children's Services obtained a temporary court order to examine all Harlan children under 18. Jacob Harlan's resistance was fierce. "No one will take my grandchildren," he told the sheriff. "God gave us these children to care for and our traditions to uphold." The operation to remove the children for medical evaluation required the presence of several state police officers. Witnesses described moving scenes of frightened children being separated from their parents. For many of them, this was the first time they had left the family property. At the Kentucky Regional Hospital, specialized doctors confirmed Dr. Caldwell's preliminary diagnoses and discovered numerous additional conditions. Timothy, the boy with Apert Syndrome, immediately underwent surgery to relieve the pressure on his brain. 3 other children were diagnosed with congenital heart disease that required surgical intervention. The case quickly became a test for the legal system. In August 1967, the county youth court held a custody hearing that lasted 5 days. Experts in medicine, social work, and law testified about the conditions on the Harlan property. Attorney Margaret Williams, assigned to represent the Harlan children, argued, "These children were deprived not only of adequate medical care but of the fundamental right to education and the opportunity to develop as individuals. The isolation imposed on them is not only physical, it represents a form of emotional and intellectual neglect." The family's defense, led by local lawyer Thomas Shepard, countered that the government was improperly interfering with a private religious community that simply wanted to live according to its own traditions. "The Harlan family represents a disappearing American way of life," Shepard argued. "They have the constitutional right to raise their children according to their religious beliefs." Judge William Harrison faced a dilemma that echoed broader tensions in 1960s American society, the balance between individual rights and collective responsibility. His decision, delivered on September 12, 1967, established a significant legal precedent. Although this court recognizes the fundamental right of parents to raise their children according to their religious beliefs, stated Judge Harrison, this right is not absolute when it endangers the physical and mental well-being of children. The evidence presented convincingly demonstrates that the endogamous marriage practices of the Harlan family have resulted in significant genetic damage to the children and that the refusal to seek proper medical treatment has compounded that harm. The court determined that 17 of the 23 Harlan children be placed under temporary state custody for medical treatment and educational assessment. Children with less severe medical conditions could return to their parents after the implementation of a supervision plan that included regular medical visits and school enrollment. The decision triggered protests from conservative religious groups and defenders of individual freedom. The Harlan case became a focal point in national debates on the limits of government intervention in family life. Letters to the editor of the Louisville Courier-Journal revealed deeply divided opinions. "What happened to the Harlan family is nothing less than government tyranny disguised as compassion," wrote a reader from Frankfort, Kentucky. "If we allow personal beliefs to overcome scientific evidence, how many more children will suffer unnecessarily?" countered another from Lexington. For the Harlans themselves, the consequences were immediate and traumatic. The family unit that had persisted for over 150 years was fragmented. Jacob Harlan, who had ruled his family with unquestionable authority, saw his world crumble. 3 weeks after the court ruling, he suffered a stroke and died 5 days later. The Harlan children, many of whom had never interacted with people outside the family, faced enormous adaptation challenges. Mary Harlan, a social worker assigned to the case, unrelated to the family, documented her experiences. "The Harlan children show extreme levels of separation anxiety and difficulty adapting to new environments. Many show significant social development delays, with communication patterns and interactions that reflect their extended isolation. Particularly moving was the case of the 8- and 10-year-old siblings, Sarah and Michael Harlan. Both had moderate intellectual deficiency and had never been separated before. Placed in different adoptive homes due to their specific medical needs, they developed severe regressive behaviors that required intensive psychological intervention. For some of the older children, integration into the outside world brought a mixture of trauma and liberation. Elizabeth Harlan, then 16, wrote in a diary that was later included in the case records, "Everything is scary and strange. The lights are very bright. People talk very fast. But for the first time, I'm learning things that Jacob would never allow us to know. Yesterday, a nurse explained to me why so many babies in our family are born sick or die. It's not God's punishment." Almost 6 decades after the Harlan family's discovery, their case continues to influence medicine, law, and social ethics. The legacy of this family, isolated in the Kentucky mountains, extends far beyond their individual circumstances, offering valuable lessons to contemporary society. Of Jacob Harlan's 23 children and grandchildren who lived on the property in 1967, we can now trace remarkably diverse life trajectories. Timothy, the boy with Apert Syndrome whose condition initially attracted Dr. Caldwell's attention, received surgery and continuous treatment. Although he never completely overcame his physical and cognitive limitations, he lived until the age of 47, far beyond what would have been possible without medical intervention. He died in 2002 due to cardiac complications related to his condition. The twins, James and John Harlan, with their disproportionate dwarfism, followed surprisingly different paths. John, adopted by a Louisville family with resources for specialized treatments, received an adapted education and eventually graduated from high school. He worked as an accountant for many years and became an advocate for the rights of people with disabilities. James, who remained closer to the original community, had less access to treatments and educational opportunities, illustrating how the environment can profoundly influence development even when genetics impose significant challenges. Sarah Harlan, one of the younger children at the time of the intervention, perhaps represents the most inspiring story. Adopted by a family of university professors, she overcame her initial developmental delays and eventually earned a degree in social work. In a remarkable turnaround, Sarah dedicated her professional career to working with isolated communities in Appalachia, helping to bring education on reproductive and genetic health to populations that, like her biological family, remained on the fringes of modern society. "I carry the Harlans not only in my DNA but in my life's mission," Sarah stated in a rare interview granted in 2005 for a documentary about the case. "Every community that I help connect with medical and educational resources represents a family like mine that can be spared unnecessary suffering." From a medical point of view, the Harlan case generated significant advances in the understanding of recessive genetic diseases. The extensive genetic mapping of the family, which began in the 1970s and continued with more advanced technologies in the following decades, helped researchers identify specific genes associated with various rare conditions. Dr. Jennifer Lowe, a geneticist at the University of Kentucky Medical Center, explains, "The meticulous records kept on the Harlan family have allowed us to track the inheritance of specific genetic mutations through multiple generations. This type of longitudinal study is extremely rare and valuable, offering insights that simply could not be obtained in any other way." In 1989, researchers using preserved family DNA samples identified a specific mutation in the FGFR2 gene responsible for Timothy's Apert syndrome. This discovery later contributed to better prenatal diagnostic methods and early interventions for children born with this condition. In the legal field, the case of Harlan versus Commonwealth of Kentucky established important precedents on the limits of family autonomy when it conflicts with child well-being. Cited in more than 40 subsequent cases involving isolated religious communities, Judge Harrison's decision continues to influence the legal balance between religious freedom and child protection. The original Harlan property, the subject of legal disputes for many years, was eventually divided among several heirs. The main house, where Jacob Harlan once ruled his small, isolated kingdom, was abandoned in the 1980s and destroyed by a fire in 1992. Today, only the stone foundations remain, gradually being reclaimed by the surrounding forest, a physical reminder of the disappearance of a way of life that lasted for nearly 2 centuries. The ethical implications of the Harlan case remain relevant in the 21st century. With the advent of advanced genetic technologies and consumer DNA tests, issues of genetic counseling, privacy, and reproductive autonomy have gained new urgency. The Harlan case reminds us that scientific knowledge must be democratized, argues Dr. Michael Sanderson, a bioethicist at the University of Chicago. When vital information on genetic health remains concentrated only among the privileged and educated, we perpetuate a system where some communities remain vulnerable to harmful patterns that could be avoided. Perhaps the most moving aspect of the Harlan legacy is how it illuminates the tension between tradition and progress, between cultural preservation and individual well-being. In isolated communities that still exist around the world, from closed religious groups to geographically remote populations, the balance between respect for traditions and protection against potentially harmful practices remains a challenge. The history of the Harlans is not simply about the biological dangers of consanguinity, but about how isolation, geographical, educational, and ideological, can create cycles of suffering that transcend generations. At the same time, it is a history of human resilience and the ability to adapt even after generations of isolation. In 2015, the University of Kentucky inaugurated the Harlan Center for Population Genetic Studies, dedicated to researching rare genetic diseases and developing extension programs for isolated rural communities. Partially funded by an anonymous donation, it is believed the benefactor is one of the family's descendants who wants to transform a legacy of suffering into a resource for prevention and education. If you've watched this far, it's because this story resonates with you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched here," so I can get to know you and see who really appreciates the stories here on the channel. Check to see if you're already subscribed so you don't miss any of the most impactful cases that reveal the hidden consequences of social and genetic isolation. Every subscription helps us continue bringing these important stories that educate and warn about the real dangers that can hide in isolated communities. Don't forget to leave your like and share this video with anyone you think would also be interested in this impressive story of American medicine. The Harlan case remains a powerful reminder that scientific knowledge, when accessible to all, has the power to free entire communities from cycles of avoidable suffering. In the words of Sarah Harlan, "My family's true tragedy was not the genes we shared, but the information we never had access to. That knowledge would have been our salvation." Today, as we look back on the history of the Harlans, we see not only a family tragedy but a microcosm that reflects broader questions about how societies handle the balance between tradition and scientific progress. In a world where isolated communities still exist, where old beliefs sometimes clash with modern knowledge, the legacy of the Harlans reminds us of our collective responsibility to ensure that life-saving knowledge is available to everyone, regardless of how distant they may be from centers of power and education. The story ends, but its lessons remain alive, echoing through generations as a call to compassion, understanding, and the democratization of knowledge that has the power to break cycles of silent suffering.